Hello, I'm EJ Cox, and welcome to the Man in the Arena podcast. On today's episode, we will be discussing this idea of Christian nationalism that's making its way through social media and on the actual media. I remember seeing a couple months ago a news reporter talking about the supposed dangers of Christian nationalism, and I've recently stumbled upon a podcast, a well-known quote-unquote deconversion podcast, which for those of you that aren't familiar with this idea of deconversion, it's people that, and predominantly were Christians who have quote-unquote deconverted from their faith, meaning they've walked away from their profession of faith, they've walked away from the church, they no longer believe in God, they no longer believe in religion. And this particular podcast did an entire hour-long episode on the idea of Christian nationalism. So today my idea is to sort of refute a few of the claims that I've heard made, as well as to hopefully provide some support for those of you that are Christians who are patriots. And there is a difference between what they are trying to frame Christian nationalism is and what true Christian patriotism is. So without further ado, we'll get into this here. So first of all, and I especially noticed it with this particular podcast that I listened to, if you are in an academic setting and you have to make your academic points with the frequent use of curse words, particularly the F word, at least in my mind and the training I had in academia, you really don't have anything to say. If you cannot articulate what you are thinking or feeling, especially in an academic setting without the use of curse words, you have not either researched it enough or you do not have the depth of knowledge to be able to speak on the topic. You're speaking from a much more emotional standpoint than a academic standpoint. And so first things first here. Christian nationalism. What is it that's being claimed? The claim is that, and I am paraphrasing here, but essentially anybody who is a Christian who believes that America has a basis in the Judeo-Christian value system, that has any basis with Christian thought, is somebody who therefore then wants to see a theocratic type government be brought into place, and that the government will then enforce Christian morality and Christian ethics and all of these types of things. Who, first of all, as somebody who I would think they would label as a Christian nationalist, that's the furthest thing from the truth. And to be quite frank, any American Christian I've met who sort of believes in the idea that America was founded upon Judeo-Christian values, the Bible, all of these, that the founding fathers recognized the hand of God in their work. None of us want a theocracy. For those of you that don't know, a theocracy is where it's basically a group of religious leaders dictate to the rest of the nation how they should live based upon their religious understanding, and then they use the force of law and the power of the sword, the monopoly of violence that the government holds, to enforce that religious ideation. America was never founded on that idea. And that is true. And we'll get into a little bit more why that is true. But I will say Iran is founded on that idea. The Ayatollah uses the government of Iran to enforce what he, as well as the rest of the religious clerics of their brand of Islam, deem right and wrong. That's why a woman can be jailed or fined or sometimes even beaten for violating anything that they state in terms of her being able to drive a vehicle or go to school, or simply, we've heard the horror stories of women that have been raped and then have been lashed because they committed sexual immorality, even though they were raped. Total lunacy like this. There is nobody within, at least to my knowledge, the conservative side of the aisle that is Christian and a patriotic American who wants anything like that at all. Really, what we believe is simply that Christianity gives you the best basis for morality, and that we as the population should return to a Christian understanding of morality. It's why we pray for revival, and we pray for God to bless this nation once again with a common passion to follow the law of God. But nobody here would, at least to my knowledge, want to enforce some type of a draconian Christian theocracy in America. Why? Well, for one, and this is one of the reasons the founders did not set this up this way, the government corrupts the church. If the government becomes involved in the church, it will corrupt it. Government is a corrupting force. It is necessary, and it is most certainly useful for the protection of the common good, facilitating trade for the individual citizen, all of these types of things. But government, especially when it is not left severely supervised, becomes a corrupting force. It's one of the things that the founding fathers saw with the Church of England. The king is the head of the Church of England. And over time, the Church of England becomes corrupted because the Church of England has to do what the king says. It is antithetical to the Bible in that sense. When we read Romans 13, God does give authority to the government. In fact, the only two professions in the Bible that are referred to as ministers of God are pastors, preachers, priests, clergymen, however you want to phrase it, and the government, because in Romans 13, Paul states that the government is essentially God's minister of justice upon the earth, and that the government does not bear the sword in vain. That really the objective of government is to enforce good morals and to punish bad ones, but the government is sort of a tool. The government, if the people become immoral, the government will become corrupted. If the government takes control of the church will become corrupted. There's a whole series of systems here. And so we do not want a government that is theocratic. The idea is that the people themselves will be a moral people, and that by being a moral people, because we have a republic, they will vote for representatives who have a strong morality, and the republic will be able to survive because good morals make for good liberty. I think in part, one of the things we could get into a discussion on, this is a topic we could go for 2 or 3 hours on, to be quite frank, but I think one of the big issues we have is a misunderstanding of what liberty is. In this podcast, they kept essentially stating that the ideas of American liberty, the ideas of the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence are antithetical to the Bible. And I'm going to read from some of the founding fathers here in a minute, but that is the furthest thing from the truth. In fact, part of the idea is that because Americans are immoral people, we have the Great Awakening that occurs 10 to 15 years before the American Revolution. There was a religious fervor going on in America at the time that as time goes on, the morality of the American people will basically self-police. You don't have to worry about people raping each other if they're following the 10 Commandments. You don't have to worry about people murdering each other if they're following the 10 Commandments. You don't have to worry largely about a lot of legal issues so long as the commandments of God are followed, the law of God is followed, the moral law of God is followed. Liberty thrives where there is sobriety. Liberty is not the absence of law. And I think that's something that has really become apparent on the left-hand side of the aisle, is they want a liberty that is essentially free of moral restraint. We want to be able to sleep with who we want to sleep with. We want to be able to do whatever drugs we want to do. We want to live our lives in reckless abandon and not have to suffer the consequences of our actions. And that is not liberty. That is tyranny of another sort. That is tyranny of anarchy. There's no law, there's no rule, there's nothing. You do as you see fit, and everybody else does as they see fit, and the entire thing falls apart. And look at where these types of political philosophies have been followed. California, New York, basically the entire West Coast and most of New England. Why is everybody leaving those places? Because it's turned into absolute chaos. There's no rule of law. Liberty and morality go hand in hand, and we'll talk about what the Founding Fathers had to say here in a minute or two. One point that I noticed that was brought up within this podcast quite a lot, and I've heard from other, anti-Christianity, really, but anti-Christianity, anti-American thoughts is, well, in God we trust wasn't put on the money until the 1920s. They didn't put under God into the Pledge of Allegiance until the 1950s. Essentially, there was no national reference to God until the Cold War and the need to reinforce morality and Christianity in the face of godless communism. Again, a lot of these folks have a romanticized view of communism that, again, Marx was this visionary. It's just that his ideas haven't been executed properly. We could go into another separate 2-hour or 3-hour long conversation on that in and of itself. Suffice it to say, for what I'm trying to get at right now, communism, even as a philosophy, is a gigantic failure. It reduces man to a materialistic idea, and that is why then in practice it doesn't work, because the philosophy itself doesn't work. But moving along, while that is true, a lot of these things that we see, in God we trust on the coin and money, under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, those weren't stated until the 1950s. That doesn't mean the sentiment was not there, for one. And for two, there are other more subtle ways that we see references to God within the national government. So one thing that I always like to point out when it comes up to this is the seal of the United States. So one of the things that even this podcast brought up is the national motto is E pluribus unum, out of the many, one, which is, of course, a reference to, especially at the time of the founding of the nation, you had these 13 different state governments who have come together to form one national government. And so there's this statement of, out of these many different peoples, out of these many different views, these many different political ideas, these very many different religious denominations, out of all of them, we have come to one government. What these men glossed over, which I actually was rather surprised about, and I shouldn't have been surprised, because when we look at these atheistic ideas, they very rarely actually scratch down below the surface of anything. On the surface, a lot of what they say does make sense, but again, it's surface level thought and it's surface level analysis. One thing I thought was interesting, very little actually any quoting from any of the Founding Fathers. They just would say, well, the Founding Fathers said X or the Founding Fathers said Y. Never giving a quote, never giving any actual academic research. Or they would say, you should just go read The Founding Myth by Andrew Seabelt, I believe is his name. Andrew Seabelt is the leader of the Freedom from Religion organization. Okay, yeah, I'm sure he is an unbiased person. And that's, again, where we can get into another separate discussion of history as a study. Everybody's biased. I am a biased person. You, the listener, you are a biased person. We are all biased. We all tell history biased. The difference, I think, is I'm trying to show you from my research. I've researched the founding of our country for over 2 years now. When you read what they had to say, it speaks volumes. And that is what we as historians should be doing, is what did they say? Not what did this person say or that person say that was born 200 years after the fact. What did they have to say? So moving on, when we come to the depth of the seal has the obverse, which is, of course, the eagle holding the olive branch of peace and the arrows of war. We have the shield and all these types of things with the motto E pluribus unum. The seal was designed in 1782 by Charles Thomson, and Charles Thomson designed the reverse of the seal. So for those of you that don't know, or haven't been taught, there is actually a reverse to the national seal. And you can see it if you get out a $1 bill. You have the eagle, the front of the seal, and then you have the reverse of the seal, which has the unfinished pyramid, the all-seeing eye. And we can really get into, there's, especially on the reverse of the seal, there is some very religious iconography there. First of all, the all-seeing eye, or the eye of providence, you'll hear, and unfortunately, even though I love the movie National Treasure, it did some real damage because it basically stated that the all-seeing eye, used especially on the dollar and in the reverse of the seal, is a Freemason symbol. We do know many of the founding fathers, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Sam Adams, were Freemasons. That is true. But the Freemasons did not actually start using that symbol until, I believe, it's 20 or 30 years after the American Revolution. The all-seeing eye of providence is actually a Christian symbol, which you can see all the way back, for example, into the image of three faces in Pontormo's 1525 Supper at Emmaus. The all-seeing eye of providence is through a lot of this Renaissance and even medieval Christian artwork as a symbol of God's all-knowing, all-seeing, ever-present presence. That God oversees all things. And of course, the unfinished pyramid then being a symbol of this nation that has been built and is continued to being built. God is overwatching this building, the building of this nation. You also have over the top of the all-seeing eye, the Latin phrase, annuit coeptus. For those of you that don't know, annuit coeptus means he has favored our undertakings. God, that is who is being referenced, has favored our undertakings. Now, of course, and I will say this as well, these men were accurate in stating that not all the founding fathers were Christians. That is true. It's something that I've taught in my class a lot, to say that all of the founding fathers were Bible-believing evangelical Christians is false. Thomas Paine spoke very much against the church as a whole. He still believed in God, but he was a deist, one of these people that God sets sort of the world in motion and then sets back and lets it work its course out. You do have a number of these people, but even then, Charles Thomson wrote this. He said, the pyramid signifies strength and duration. The eye over it and the motto allude to the many signal interpositions of providence in favor of the American cause. So right there, and the seal is again designed in 1782, this reverse of the seal is to show, in part, that at least one of them, Charles Thomson, he was the secretary of the Constitutional Convention that designed this. He believed that God used his hands to help build this nation, to help the cause of American independence come to success. The date, he continues, the date underneath is that of the Declaration of Independence, and the words under it signify the beginning of the new American era, which commences from that date. So for those of you that don't know, underneath of the pyramid, so if you get a $1 bill out, you can see it. Underneath of the pyramid, it says Novus Ordo Seclorum, or a new order for the ages. And this is something that you see reflected a lot within that era of the founding, is this idea that we have been brought by God as a new order of liberty, of personal liberty, of freedom, that God has designed us to be a new order for the ages. So that, and it touches a little bit on this idea that was mentioned in this podcast, and they said, well, Christians believe that America is God's chosen people. And I think that in part that's true. I've heard phrases like that we are God's chosen people. I think in large part, if you ask most American Christians that they would label as Christian nationalists, we would say that it's not that we are a chosen people. It's that we set out at the start to bring a new era of freedom to the world. And then we did this of course, George Washington praying all the time. You did have a lot of Christian elements involved in this, that God favored this because it recognizes individual liberty. It recognizes the idea that people should be free. We talk about in the Bible, there's so many references, especially in the New Testament, to the new law of liberty. That Christ has purchased us with his blood and has freed us from the chains of sin, has freed us from the sting of death, has freed us from the former things, the former way, the fallen nature of the world. And so God has favored us. This is why we are so concerned about trying to bring America back to the people being reverent to God, because when the people lose their reverence for God, God will turn his face from us. Just as God turned his face from Israel when she worshiped the Baals and sacrificed her own children on the altars of Baal, and God punished them, brought them into captivity under the Babylonians, God will not allow us to flourish if we turn our backs on that which is right, if we turn our backs on him, if we walk away. It's not that we are somehow some special nation. It's simply that, like all other nations, if we follow God, if we follow the laws of God, if we recognize God, we will be blessed. If we turn away from those things, we will be punished. It's as simple as that. And again, what was also interesting to me is in this podcast, they were, well, basically, you Christians, you're so concerned about transsexuality and the gays coming after your children and on and on and on. You lose sight of the real issues. My friend, those are the real issues. That is a supreme moral issue. Sexuality is one of those things, especially if you read the Bible, the Torah, the Quran. Sexuality is something that's heavily covered in any of the Abrahamic religions, and especially within Christianity and Judaism. There's this focus on the only approved form of sexuality by God is that between a man and a woman in marriage, because that marriage reflects the relationship of Messiah with the church. And it is a holy thing. When you engage in the sacrament of marriage, it is a holy thing. And I'll actually get to that here in a minute. But I'm going to bring up some different quotes from the founders. Give me a second here. I get my Bible. All right. So I have a couple quotes here. Benjamin Franklin, and again, Benjamin Franklin is one of the least religious of the founders. I would say he was either a deist or perhaps a theological rationalist. But he had this to say. Benjamin Franklin stated, "To conclude, I beg I may not be understood to infer that our General Convention was divinely inspired when it formed the new federal constitution." So Ben, being Ben, is not one to really talk on God working out miracles. He was definitely somebody kind of like Thomas Jefferson, who believed in God, but believed that God did not perform miracles in the way that it is described in the Bible. There is a very interesting, I would say, cognitive dissonance with some of those men in that way. But listen to then what he continues on to say. "Yet I must own that I have so much faith in the general government of the world by providence." So he's almost reversing himself and stating, well, God does still preside over the world, that I can hardly conceive a transaction of such momentous importance to the welfare of millions now existing, and to exist in the posterity of a great nation, should be suffered to pass without being in some degree influenced, guided, and governed by that omnipotent, omnipresent, and beneficent ruler in whom all inferior spirits live and move and have their being. He just quoted the Bible, that in God we live and move and have our being. It's amazing. And again, I come back to, I find it so interesting with a lot of the atheists that I've talked to. Their atheism is so surface level. And a lot of their arguments, so this argument against the influence of Christianity within America, that the founding fathers, this is one of the things they brought up in this podcast, they weren't really all that religious. They believed religion was a useful tool to control the masses. I mean, that's getting into some Marxist thinking there. But it's such a surface level pattern of thought. There's not really a deep level of thought to it. And I can't remember which well-known scientist said it, but there was a well-known scientist that said something to the effect of, your first sip from the cup of science will turn you into an atheist. But when you reach the bottom of the glass, you will find God there. That on the surface, you can make anything seem to be without God. But when you really dig and you really look and you really spend the time, I think back to, for example, and those of you that are Christians, that have been Christians for a long time will know this name, Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell wrote the book Evidence Demands a Verdict. He was in law school and was an atheist, and Josh McDowell said, my basically thesis for my JD, I'm going to go and disprove the Bible. I'm going to find all of the points in which it contradicts itself, all of the points in which it has these faults and failures, and I will prove basically that because the Bible is not infallible, that therefore God does not exist. And what Josh McDowell found is that the longer he studied the Bible and the longer he dug into it, the longer he really sunk his teeth into the study of it, you come to God. He is there. He is always there. And I pray for these men and women that really have fallen into this atheistic trap. Just dig further. Read deeper. Read outside of people that echo what you believe. I always am reading different atheists and things like this. We have a special visitor. This is our, keep rolling. You're still rolling? This is our cat, Jazzy. She likes to come in and sit and read the Bible with me from time to time. She also likes looking at herself in the reflection here of our little framed china plate. Hello. Did you have anything to say? Okay, it's time for you to leave now. Anyways, continuing on here, we have another quote from Charles Pinckney, who was another one of the framers of the Constitution. He said that nothing less than that superintending hand of God that so miraculously carried us through the war, in my humble opinion, could have brought it, the Constitution, about so complete upon the whole. That God worked through these men, and God, even if they didn't realize it, and this is one of those things that as Christians we believe this, God works through all men. Whether you're Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, atheist, God will use you. There is no man that escapes the touch of God. He may not realize it, he may not recognize it, he may run from it, he may deceive himself to it, but ultimately all things, all people, all plants, all creatures fit into the plan of God in some way. The mind of God is limitless, so it's not something we can really fathom in that sense. I think about in the Old Testament, God uses the pagan Babylonians and all of these the Persians to accomplish his goals. So even if you don't recognize God, God may still use you to accomplish his plans. Alexander Hamilton stated, he represented New York at the Constitutional Convention. He made this statement: "For my own part, I sincerely esteem it a system which without the finger of God never could have been suggested and agreed upon by such a diversity of interests." Our founding is so much a miracle simply because we were so divided. There were so many partial local interests between the North and the South and the New England states and the Southern states. Between all of these different groups of people, they had so many different interests, but it's a miracle that they were able to do what they did. They stood up to the largest navy the world had ever seen. They stood up to the most winningest army the world had ever known. There is a reason the British Empire was called the empire on which the sun never sets, because it owned territory literally around the globe. somewhere the sun was shining on British possessions. And this group of ragtag farmers and businessmen, seemingly out of nowhere, were able to stand up to and defeat that army and that navy and that government, and to bring about this new birth of freedom. And so to continue, I have here a quote from George Washington that he wrote at Newburgh on June 14th, 1783, sent to the 13 governors of the states. This is as he is disbanding the Continental Army at the end of the Revolution. He says, "I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection." I'm not really sensing the modern idea of the separation of church and state here. We'll get to that in a minute. In his holy protection, that he would incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another, for their fellow citizens of the United States at large, and particularly for brethren who have served in the field. And finally, that he, being God, would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. He's referencing Christianity here. And without a humble imitation of whose example in these things, we can never hope to be a happy nation. George Washington said it right there, that unless we imitate that which God has set down for us to imitate, we cannot be a happy nation. And I think what one of the pitfalls of a lot of these atheistic arguments have, they want basically official government documentation from time immemorial that we are a Christian nation, and that the government is intended to enforce Christian thought. It wasn't necessary because the people were Christians. This is all part of the idea with the Constitution, is that the Constitution is not designed to inform morality. And this is one of the issues you have with atheism, is when you remove God, something must take its place. And it always defaults to the government. It is the next most powerful force on this planet, aside from God, is government. It's the old saying, what are the two most sure things in life? Death and taxes. And this is what the founders had when they framed this nation, is that the Constitution is not designed to inform morality. The Constitution is simply there to list how the government is supposed to function, list the rights that the people have, that the government is to protect, but that is it. The government is there to protect and ensure the liberty of the people. That is all. It is not designed to inform morality. And this is, James Madison, for example, said that if the people become immoral, and I am paraphrasing him somewhat, but that if the people become immoral, they will then surrender their liberty to an external or internal invader. Morality makes for liberty. Anywhere you look where morality has been abandoned, liberty ceases to be. And this is where we get into really the Christian theology and Christian thought, and whether you're Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. This is kind of getting into what G.K. Chesterton used to refer to as mere Christianity, and that C.S. Lewis then wrote his book, Mere Christianity. All men are by their nature evil. God has given us his law. God has given us these things that we may be able to imitate, and they inform us about right and wrong. And ultimately, the law itself is not enough to save you. You cannot follow the law perfectly because you are, again, an evil creature. Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, and by his blood purchased you from sin and all of these types of things. It took the supreme sacrifice of God to rescue man from the consequences of evil. And this is again with our government. Our government is designed to function with a moral people. It is not designed to function with immoral people. And the founders themselves even realized the propensity of man to become immoral and for government to become corrupted. Else, why did they write so many checks and balances into the Constitution? That document, in a way, almost makes the government inefficient because of how many different things have to occur before anything can actually get done. And the purpose is to put as many guards in place to prevent corruption from spreading. But it is ultimately up to the people. It comes from the people. Moral people will vote for moral representatives who then pass and enact moral laws. And that is how it is supposed to function. So anyways, continuing on here. We have another quote from Daniel Webster. Now, Daniel Webster was not a framer of the Constitution, but he was one of the most prominent statesmen in that period before the Civil War and after the American Revolution. And he made a statement which I've always loved. This was in 1843, and he was actually speaking about the Founding Fathers while they were celebrating the completion of the Bunker Hill Monument. And this is what Daniel Webster wrote. He said, "The Bible came with them. And it is not to be doubted that to free and universal reading of the Bible in that age, men were much indebted for right views of civil liberty. The Bible is a book of faith and a book of doctrine and a book of morals and a book of religion, of special revelation from God. But it is also a book which teaches man his own individual responsibility, his own dignity, and his equality with his fellow man." What I thought was so interesting listening to that podcast is that several times, and I mean several times, these two men made the statement that the Bible is antithetical to liberty, that the Bible stands in direct opposition to the Declaration of Independence. You have such a facile reading of the Bible then. What does the New Testament teach? And we discussed this in our last video on race in America. The Bible teaches there is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer free or slave. There is no longer Scythian or barbarian, but all are one in Christ. Every social movement of the 19th century to remove slavery, to bring women to the right to vote, it all ultimately has a base in the Bible. The idea that a black man is the same as a white man because he was created by God comes from the Bible. Because you cannot logically be a Christian who believes that God created all men and died to save all men from all races and say that a black man is not your equal, or that an Asian man is not your equal, or that X or Y. It is not to say that there are not people who have perverted the Bible, because that is very true, or to say that there are people who use the name of Christian and then do things that are unchristian. That is also true. But the liberty that we have enjoyed in this nation, the protection of civil liberty that we have enjoyed in this nation comes from the fact that the men that wrote the Constitution, the men that put these ideas into motion, when you read the Declaration of Independence, we are endowed with certain inalienable rights by our Creator. Right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It comes from the Bible. We were created with these things. It is the right and duty of all men to try to protect this right and duty for all others. It's why the tyranny anywhere is a threat to freedom everywhere. Because if tyranny can spread, it brings men under this crushing spirit. It removes their ability to think freely. It removes their ability to move with the thoughts of their heart and to pray to God and to allow God to instruct them as to how they should go. It's why communism is such a failure for civil liberty. Communism has always been a failure, especially in that regard. It amazes me that these men who speak so much of rights don't really understand the origin of rights or what a right is. They went on for a while about Republican judges, senators, whatever, coming after Roe v. Wade. Abortion is not a right. Killing an unborn child is not a right. I'm sorry, it's not. There's nowhere in any of the founding documents where that was discussed. There's nowhere in the Bible that is discussed. To murder your own child is not a right. And to think of it as such is to have a perversion of the idea of liberty. I would like to finish with this final quote. And this is from Benjamin Rush, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote this in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He said, "I've always considered Christianity as the strong ground of republicanism. The spirit is opposed not only to splendor, but even to the very forms of monarchy, and many of its precepts have for their objects republican liberty and equality, as well as simplicity, integrity, and economy in government. It is only necessary for republicanism to ally itself to the Christian religion to overturn all the corrupted political and religious institutions of the world." So with that final quote, I'm your host, E.J. Cox. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Man in the Arena podcast. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And if you like what you listened to or saw, please give us a like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube. With that being said, good luck and Godspeed, and live in liberty, my friends.